Today we're talking about core loops, and no, not that thing from Ring Fit. Core loops are at the center of any well-designed game. They create a natural flow of gameplay and keep players engaged and entertained. A strong core loop makes for an incredible game that you want to keep coming back to. A weak core loop, on the other hand, makes the game forgettable and boring. The big thing I've been working on for my game, The Last Flower, has been trying to really nail down my core loop. But what is a core loop anyway? A core loop, that phrase is starting to sound weird now, describes the low-level gameplay steps at the center of your game's design. For example, in Mario Bros., think of the core loop as all of the basic things that you do in a level. You enter the level, walk or run, platform by jumping on or over platforms and obstacles, reach the goal, repeat. Everything else, like getting power-ups or kicking Koopa shells, are part of mini-loops or interactions that complement the core loop to make a full, entertaining game. Initially, the core loop I had defined for The Last Flower was this. Enter a wave, move around, shoot enemies, avoid letting the player or the flower take damage, end the wave, collect an upgrade, and then repeat. But after testing with friends, it was clear that the loop was pretty weak. The core of it was good. Shooting enemies and gaining upgrades in a wave-based format is a pretty proven loop, but there was something missing. One of the key notes of feedback was that the game felt a little basic. There wasn't really much going on, and there wasn't much variety from wave to wave. My friends had a few suggestions: add different weapons into the game, add structures like a water tank or a generator to protect in addition to the flower, add enemies that don't target the flower, and a few more. I think it's incredibly important to get feedback from other people that aren't on your team. Without it, you lose perspective on what you're making and you don't notice things that other people notice. I believe getting feedback early and often is key to making a really good game. In fact, I think feedback is so important that I recently started a Discord server. I want to build a community of The Last Flower players to get critical feedback directly from the people playing the game and watching these devlogs. If you join, you'll be one of the first people to get access to the demo when it's available this summer. Link is in the description. While I was sorting through all of the feedback from my friends and trying to think of how to solve the problems they brought up, I worked on some other quality of life improvements I had already planned. I updated the game over screen to have restart and exit buttons, all of which is placeholder for now, but it makes playtesting way easier when I send people builds. People used to have to quit out of the game manually and then reopen it, and it was kind of a pain. I also added a placeholder main menu with a placeholder logo, and no, me calling all of this placeholder is not a defense mechanism, it's actually all going to be replaced. The main menu is a lot less jarring when people play the game and first boot it up, rather than getting dropped right into the first wave. I also added a transition between hitting play and starting the game, which I learned from this Brackeys tutorial, and it makes the level transition feel a lot smoother and adds a ton of polish. I also made a bunch of little fixes, like fixing some graphical glitches with the tiles, moving all of the dead enemy bodies to a different layer, adding a muzzle flash when you shoot, and adjusting the screen shake. All super quick, but really impactful. One of the bigger things I implemented was adding health and ammo pickups. In testing, I found that it was difficult to rely on having enough currency to purchase health or ammo from the shops, especially when the flower was the most likely to be damaged and needed to be healed. Implementing health and ammo drops also helps guarantee that the player has a chance to survive and is less likely to end up in a situation where they lose because they don't have enough ammo. As much as I love Nuclear Throne, I find it incredibly frustrating when I'm having a decent run and then I end up losing because I run out of ammo and can't do damage any other way. The game certainly mitigates this situation by having melee weapons and some of the mutations do damage without a weapon, but I think it's a situation that just isn't as fun as a player, because it's possible that there's absolutely nothing you can do, and losing control in a game that requires control and mastery just isn't fun. The health and ammo pickups have a scaling chance to spawn based on your current health and ammo, meaning that if you're low on health, you're more likely to get a health pickup, and same for ammo. The system also accounts for an item affecting the drop chance, similar to how Rabbit's Paw in Nuclear Throne works. I don't have an item for it yet, but I'm planning to add it later on. Speaking of items, I created a few sprites for some of the existing items and came up with some names and flavor text for them. The first is Damage Up. This has now become Potent Formula. Fire Rate Up has become Sawed Off Nozzle, and Movement Speed Up has become Jitter Cup. Even though the effects are the same as before, something about having art and names attached to them makes the items feel so much more interesting. Incidentally enough, I noticed in playtesting that everyone tended to choose all three of these and ignore the other items that didn't have artwork yet. It could be a coincidence, but I think it just goes to show that the more polished everything in your game is, the better an impression it will have on your players. The last thing I did outside of the feedback I received was changing the enemy spawner system from being a fixed, manually generated system to an infinite, procedurally generated one. Before, I had to manually define every aspect of the wave: what enemies would spawn, how many, how quickly, etc. Now I've set it up so that each wave increments the number of enemies each wave. When new enemies are implemented, the system will take into account what wave the player is on and spawn enemies that are allowed to appear in that wave. It'll also be able to spawn different enemies each wave, so that wave 5 in one run is different from wave 5 in another run. The system will take a huge load off of me as a developer and will make for a far more interesting game for players. After all that was done, I began sorting through the feedback that my friends had given me. Aside from their direct feedback about weapons and some other interesting ways to add to the core loop, the other piece of feedback was that items were super unbalanced. If you wanted to survive more than a wave or two, you were essentially forced to take Potent Formula and Sawed-Off Nozzle. Obviously this is a huge problem. Players should be able to take whatever items they want and still have at least a fighting chance. Having a dominant strategy around items is something I'm deliberately trying to avoid, so catching it this early was really helpful. That said, the solution for that balancing problem isn't super straightforward. I could reduce the effectiveness of the items, lower the health of the enemies, lower the number of enemies that spawn each wave, or even remove those items altogether. It's something I want to think on a little bit more, and I need to focus on getting the features I want into the game before I spend a bunch of time on balance. I did end up deciding to think about the weapons idea a little bit more. The feedback was basically that adding different weapons that aren't tied to the items could add an extra layer of complexity that would make the game and the core loop a lot more interesting, while adding a minimal amount of scope and effort on my end. I thought about it for a while, and there were two implementations that made sense for my game. The first was to do a random weapon crate like Call of Duty Zombies does. If you're not familiar, it's basically a box on the map where you can spend points earned by killing zombies to receive a random weapon. The other implementation would be to do something a lot more like Hades and give the player a choice of weapon prior to starting the run and then locking them into that weapon for the entire run. This would also require players to unlock the other weapons by achieving some sort of requirement, which would give the game a bit more longevity and replayability. I think it's obvious just from my description which one I went with. I decided to go with the Hades-like system. I think replayability will be a strength of The Last Flower, so anything I could do to improve that is worth doing. I was able to reuse a lot of the work I did on the item system for the weapon system. I made weapons a scriptable object that can hold a bunch of different stats, such as damage, fire rate, bullet spread, etc. This will let me easily make weapons feel really different without having to add a ton of work. The scriptable object stats of the weapons feed directly into the player's stats and the shooting system, so choosing a weapon is basically plug and play at this point. The one thing that will require additional work is if I want to add something like a triple shot or a shotgun style blast or some other sort of behavior. Those will require coding the shot pattern, which isn't an existing stat, but it won't be that bad to implement when I get there. Speaking of which, if you have ideas for weapons, leave your ideas down in the comments below. I'd love to hear them. For now, choosing a weapon is done right in the main level. The player can see the description of each weapon and then choose whichever one they prefer. Once the weapon is chosen, the run begins and the first wave starts spawning. I'm not sure if this is how I'll keep it in the final version of the game, but it's a good placeholder for now. The weapon system really complements the item system well. It adds a layer of complexity similar to what Hades does. Now instead of one or two perks always being the right choice, it'll depend on the weapon a lot more. For example, if one weapon has a higher rate of fire, it might not make sense to take Sawed-Off Nozzle because it won't really change much. Speaking of the item system, one of the pieces of feedback was that after you completed the first couple waves and got the maximum number of items, the game got a lot more boring. As a way of combating that, I decided to implement a level system. Now, you only get items at the end of a wave that you level up. In order to level up, you have to kill enemies, each of which are worth varying amounts of XP. This provides for a really nice mini loop where the player is not only killing waves of enemies, but it's now also trying to level up in order to gain more items. One of the questions you might be asking about this system right now is that if each enemy is worth the same XP, and every wave has a specific number of enemies that spawn, won't the player always level up on the same waves every run? And currently, yes, you're right, that is what happens. However, once other enemies are added, I'll be able to make some enemies worth more or less XP than others, and can even add some enemies that will despawn without being killed by the player, increasing your incentive to kill every enemy you see. The weapon and level systems add a lot more complexity to the game's loop than it really needed. They're not necessarily part of the core loop, but they're mini loops that interact with that core and make for a much more interesting game. These two things alone won't carry the game though. The biggest thing I can do to make the game more exciting at this point is adding more content. More enemies with different behavior, more items with different effects, and more weapons with different stats. The variety of enemies in particular will really make the game feel a lot better. Outside of changes to the game itself, one of the bigger things I worked on recently was a lot of project planning and marketing work. I'm a project manager by trade, so a lot of the organization and planning tasks come pretty naturally to me. I spent some time thinking through the scope for the game and what I could reasonably accomplish by myself with my current skill set. I then put together a rough timeline of when I think I can get the game done with my current pace and scope. And I don't want to say the exact time frame for release just yet, since it's still early on and things could change pretty greatly between then and now, but I'm pretty confident in hitting my targets. I also planned out the major marketing beats for the game between now and release, which really helps put into perspective the level of polish I need to be at by a certain time. It's a pretty ambitious set of beats and timeline, but I know that if I don't do it, my game has no chance of succeeding. If I've learned anything from other indie developers, especially folks on YouTube, it's that your game has no chance of succeeding if you don't market it early and often, and I genuinely want The Last Flower to succeed. I'm on a good pace to get to the release date I set for myself and hit the marketing beats that I want to hit, so I'm feeling pretty confident about it so far. But I've got a lot of work ahead of me for the next few months, and I'm really excited to show you all what I do. Anyway, that's going to be a wrap for this devlog. Be sure to join the Discord if you want early access to the demo and want to hear about everything I'm planning for The Last Flower. I'm Tyler Haddad, thank you so much for watching.